Hi everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, lovely to see you again. And I'm going to talk about the last extraordinary 10 years, and they are extraordinary. You know, a transgender movement developed, and now we're fighting it, and it's going down. I mean, all within 10 years. I mean, that's kind of an extraordinary situation. And the PhDs are not yet being written on it, but they will be, how this extraordinary phenomenon happened and was defeated. I mean, they're going to be exciting PhDs. Wish I was younger and I could supervise them. Okay, so that's the situation we're in, this extraordinary time in history, which is not yet being written about as that extraordinary chunk of time. I suppose because we're not yet sufficiently over it. So my book, Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism, was published 10 years ago, this year. It was the first book in 35 years since Janice Raymond's wonderful Transsexual Empire that gave a feminist perspective on men's sexual perversion of transvestism, or as it is more commonly called now, autogynephilia. The sexual perversion that some men have of being sexually aroused by the thought of themselves as a woman. Transvestites call this sexual excitement their gender identity. That's a posh name for getting your penis up, really. And it's under this banner that they have, in recent years, set out to attack women's rights and bind men's states and parliaments, and I do call them men's states and parliaments because it's so clear that they are, to the recognition of their excitements. I want to talk about what the situation was in relation to gender identity, so-called, when I wrote the book, and where we've got to today. I do this in a spirit of celebration, because I think we have now turned the tide. I first wrote about transvestism back in 1978, when I said in the London Women's Liberation newsletter that men might as well say they were ducks or 747 aeroplanes as say they were women. It was absurd. And that's how, you know, the vast majority of feminists felt at that time. And there were only one or two of these men trying to get into women's discos and so on. It was tiny, because the phenomenon had not been created at the time. There was fury from feminists about these men, and pretty much agreement about how absurd the whole thing was. Then I wrote next about this male sexual practice in my book Anti-Climax in 1990. I have a chapter in there. I'd been reading the autobiographies of what were then called transsexuals. And I was opposed to these men pretending to be women. It seemed to me insulting to women that men could play such silly games and receive one moment's respect for it. But when I read these books, I was appalled at the sex stereotypes that these men believed in. I mean, they were truly extraordinary reads. And probably I was the only ordinary person reading them. Most people had no interest in me. Anyway, I was in a movement to abolish sex stereotypes while these men were writing books about how lovely it was to be able to cry. Yeah, they had the hormones, they couldn't cry. Oh, and they had the hormones and they lost their sense of direction. I mean, seriously, absolutely seriously, that is what these books said. And they were terribly excited to be able to cry and lose their sense of direction. Now, transvestites still write about this on their social media, how they find themselves able to cry every day, because this is something they believe to be an inevitable part of women's nature, and now they suddenly have it. Believe me, it's out there. They're talking about how they learned to cry. I have rarely seen women cry. I mean, women don't cry all that much, actually, although there's an idea that they do, and maybe they should, considering their situation. So they wrote in their autobiographies about how lovely it was to be grabbed by a burly taxi driver who thought supposedly that they were women. Actually, women don't like that much. And actual women find sexual assault disturbing. But at that time, I did not understand autogynephilia, the male sexual perversion that lies at the root of the majority of men's cross-dressing behaviour. I still thought it was something to do with homosexuality. But that was 33 years ago, you know, but I was wrong, and that's how I identified it at the time. But actually nobody else was writing about it at all, certainly not from a feminist perspective. So it's not entirely surprising that I was wrong. There are many people who find it hard to understand this behaviour as a male sexual perversion, even today. There are even some feminists who think it must be something going on that, that's innate in some way, and that there are real transsexuals and so on. So if women, even feminists, are finding this hard today to look at the sex stuff, it's not surprising. 33 years ago, I didn't completely get it. Okay. In 1997, I've become aware of the increasing practice amongst adult lesbians, who are not sexually excited by cross-dressing, of course, of seeking testosterone injections, mastectomies, and phalloplasties in an attempt to look like men. And I wrote my first despairing article for a journal on that topic. How could this happen when we'd had a lesbian feminist movement in which women were hugely proud to be women and to be lesbians? How had this horrifying mutilation come to pass? And that was 26 years ago. Right? It was mostly in the US at that time, but of course it's huge here now as well. By the early 2000s, I'd increased my concerns to encompass the transgendering of children, and because I was in Australia at that time, I was aware of what was going on at the clinic in Melbourne, and you could actually get all of the accounts of the consultations, and you could see what the doctors were saying about the children had to perform in front of them, like little drag queen boys or whatever, and they said how lovely as girls they looked, and lovely golden hair. Yes, the doctors were saying this when they decided that this was okay, because at that time the cases had to go to court, which is why you could get the transcripts. Then a couple of years later they took that out, and the cases didn't have to go to court, so they could just push them through like school dinners. So by 2000, and I started writing, I had a piece in the Australian and so on, so I'm starting to write about the transgendering of children. Nobody else was, I'd go to politics conferences and give workshops on this, and everybody would sit there politely and a bit surprised. No actual interest. And I was telling them what was going on, what was being said, so on. By 2007, I'd accumulated enough very serious concerns about the politics and practice of transgenderism to think I needed to write a whole book on the subject. I sent a proposal to a feminist publisher, but they didn't think at the time there was sufficient interest in the subject. And maybe they were right, because when it did get published in 2014, I think there was the beginning to be enough interest that the book went down better than it would have in 2007. By the time I wrote the book, there were a few feminist websites and blogs, but nothing in the mainstream world anywhere from a feminist perspective. There were no feminist books, commentaries, articles that were critical, only online resources such as those of the wonderful Gender Trender, who for many years put up all the news and idiocy on her blog from the burgeoning transgender industry. She was keeping everybody informed, and there was wonderful Dave the Squirrel, who did very funny stuff, showing the men showing off in front of their mirrors in their ball gowns. It was absolutely hilarious. So there were a few of us really laughing, but otherwise there was nothing going on out there. There were a huge number of books, of course, by both men and women who fancied that they had changed sex, and there was a vast academic industry celebrating mostly the men's behaviour. Masses and masses of books, including by my publisher, Routledge. I mean, it was just, an avalanche, an absolute avalanche, not a single feminist voice. Really, really, really nothing. Now, it's hard to imagine now that no feminist critique had ventured off the internet at that time, but that was the case. What propelled me to do a whole book in 2014 was that there were no longer just a few separate absurdities going on in relation to transvestism, with a whole landscape opening up of harms to many constituencies, those who tried to change sex themselves, their wives and partners, lesbians who fell victim to this medical malpractice, and to children, as well as to feminism and the rights of women in general, which is what became, what the book was about. Men's fetish behaviour was being talked about as a human right instead of just a sexual perversion, and it was previously understood. This was a whole new level of social and political damage that no one else was writing about, except in blogs. So I needed to be a whistleblower, and that is why I did the book. So let's just have a think about what's changed in the 10 years since the book was published. At first it was a struggle to build a feminist movement to defeat the ideas and practices of these male sexual fetishists. The men were honing their idea that they should have the right to perform their fetish in all public places and all places and spaces previously set aside for women, and so on. They were moving very, very fast at that time. Gradually, in the UK, feminist groups were set up. in the last 10 years. Many feminist books have been written in the Anglo-speaking world and now in Spanish and in other languages like Korean, who've published gender hurts in Korean and so on. This is a huge advance. Some of these groups and books were quite tentative, perhaps because the authors want to be able to believe that there are men who are real and genuine trans women. At least certainly a few years ago, some women were trying to pretend that. Now far fewer women believe there are real ones, or that trans woman is a suitable word, since these men are not any kind of woman and should not be pandered to. Some of the new groups and new feminists coming together specifically to confront the threat were rather determined, and still are, to keep me out of the public eye. I mean, my books were interesting and there's a lot of information in there, but I was seen as embarrassing because I was likely to mention the sex, which none of the new feminists wanted to do, because they wanted to be respectable and pretend that only a few of the transvestites were a problem. So talking about what the men actually did, you know, the picking up used tampons and putting them up their bottoms in the women's toilets and so on, they didn't want somebody who would say that, and I always said that. It's still going on, you know? I am not respectable. In 2019, I launched with 3 other women a new organisation, Women's Declaration International, to fight for women's sex-based rights against the onslaught of men's gender identity demands, and Anna's been talking about this, so I don't need to say very much about that, except to say, please come and join us, watch our videos. It's a very important international organisation which is giving voices to women everywhere who are picking up everything that's happening. They can see what you're doing here, and getting ideas from each other. Really, really important to be able to do that. So sign the declaration. Meanwhile, a most significant development took place. The transvestites took over the existing gay organisations, ones which already had the ear of the state and charitable status. They were already consulted on issues of homosexuality and ran training courses for organisations. That was already happening here on homosexuality. So in 2014, at the moment at which my book came out, the main gay advocacy group in the UK, Stonewall, adopted transvestism as its new cause. Up to that point, there'd been opposition to that happening. And in the States in the early 2000s, there was a lot of opposition from gay men's organisations to including the transvestites. They were right. They thought it would damage their cause. It has damaged their cause. When Stonewall did pick up transgenderism, it was able to impose the idea that men had this male fetish right onto hundreds of government departments, educational establishments, health services, corporations, and of course that's happening here through ACON. So exactly the same tactics are being used everywhere. I know we'll never understand the success of it all, and how could all of these tactics have worked, and what are all the tactics? I mean, it's an extraordinary project which we can't possibly really engage with. So what still needs to be done? It's possible to be hopeful, I think, in the UK, very possible, in Turf Island, because the tide of public opinion has turned. Have there been surveys here in this country about what actual people think about all of this? No, they have in other places.
Loose ones on like Facebook or
I mean serious public opinion.
Australia ran the most serious one so far and had, I think, 1,600 participants, something like that.
Yeah, it seems to be, the surveys seem to show 60-70% of the public or whatever actually think that this is absurd and should not happen. Seems pretty general. That wouldn't have been the case 10 years ago, because everybody would have just thought it's a form of homosexuality and we must be nice. That's what people thought in those days. In the UK, the newspapers that were silent on the issue or determinedly carried good news stories all the time about the transgendering of children, about transvestite celebrities, and now not so obviously keen to do so now. Something's really changing, and that's been really recent, just in the last couple of months, really. Supposedly lefty and progressive media outlets such as the Guardian newspaper, New Statesman magazine are now carrying stories critical of the practice. Imagine that. I mean, it's a huge change. It's a huge change. They went up like a rocket, the fetishist activists, and they're going to come down in the same way. Now, this is mostly confined, though, the critical articles, to the transgendering of children. This has at last been recognised as a harm. Other more conservative newspapers, such as the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, etc., are covering all of those things. I realise I have very little time left, so I'm going to go on to what needs to be done. You know what's been done, all the court cases and getting rights in the workplace to actually say that you have a sex and all of those sorts of things, okay? So let's just go on to what has not been covered so much. In the book, basically what we've been getting success with is in the outside world, in the workplace, we're a bit with sports, and we're working on prisons and so on, all the outside world. What we're not doing so well with, and I had chapters on this in the book, is what happens in relationships and in the home. Nobody wants to look at that much, and there's, no newspapers would cover anything about the effect of what the men do on their wives, on their children, on their mothers, and on lesbian partners and so on. None of that is seen as relevant in any way still, but I did cover all of it in the book because I thought it was absolutely crucial. So one thing that I suggest we can perhaps gather or move towards from this meeting is trying to get the anti-violence movement to accept that men transgendering on their children and their wives is actually a form of psychological violence. Absolutely. I don't know why nobody took that up. It's what I say should happen in the book, but it was 10 years ago and nothing has happened. So I'll just say a couple of things, because I haven't got room for all of the stuff I would like to talk about in relation to the trans widows, as they're now called. They've got a website and so on. One of the things that men do in relation to their children, and in fact I saw a photograph of this on Facebook just a couple of days ago, is they do little putting on makeup together sessions with their daughters, because they want to be little girls again and they didn't have a childhood. So it's so lovely with their 8-year-old to be putting on makeup with them, and they photograph themselves doing it. I understand this as a form of serious harm. The fact that any kind of domestic violence in the home is a form of serious harm to children is rarely recognised. We haven't even got there yet. But this is a serious harm of men who transgender, because I think actually maybe what we should be starting to say is men should not be permitted to transgender in the home, where it affects anybody else. Only in toilets in hotels, perhaps. Nobody's there, they can't affect anybody, if they have to do it at all. That's where they used to do it. Right? So we need to push them back into the hotel toilets. They should not be allowed to do it in the home, where it affects their wives terribly, who speak of terrible loss, who are told they have to be lesbians, all this really, really terrible stuff, of terrible humiliation. Their mothers experience a terrible sense of loss. They've known this man as their son for 50 years, and they lose him. And he's gone potty and started wearing women's knickers. I mean, it's a very serious loss for the mothers as well. So yes, I think let's start saying they mustn't do it in the home, because it cannot but affect women and children. It affects others, it's harmful to others, it's mentally harmful to others, and we must stop it. And we need to get it understood as psychological violence. So I think there's a bit to do on what these men are doing in the home, not just outside it. Thank you.